Happy New Year.
Like that, we're live. Welcome to a new year of the .NET Doc Show. This is the year 2021, finally, or I guess for some, you may believe it's still 2020. We are bringing you another 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. As doctors of .NET, we aim to prescribe healthy, gluten-free choices in the world of .NET. Get that last part out. I'm your host, Scott Addy, and with me today are co-hosts Cecil Phillip and Cam Soper. Our regularly scheduled guest had a conflict today, and so we looked to the bullpen, and sure enough, David Pine was ready to go, and he had something to queue up for us today that we promise will be equally as interesting. And of course, this guest, David Pine, requires no introduction.
Although we should let him talk about himself. We never really let him talk about himself. Here, Dave, tell us about yourself.
Hi, friends. I'm actually one of the co-hosts of the .NET Doc Show. I'm excited to
tell
be
us
here.
About that. What's that like?
So it's the show that we've started back in February. Oh my gosh, we're almost circling a year, aren't we? Of last year, the dreaded 2020. And it was this gorgeous vision of inspiring and celebrating the developer community in .NET. And so today, I'm excited to be here and fill in and hopefully provide some sort of value to our viewers and friends. And that's me.
And we, certainly thank you for having a topic ready for us to cover today.
I was thinking about that. Our bullpen consists of, let me count. Dave. Yeah, Dave. That's our bullpen.
Don't put too much thought into it, Cam. All right. Well, why don't we just roll right into the checkup segment? All right. So for our checkup doc today, what we have is a quick start doc from our docs.microsoft.com platform, particularly for the Azure Cognitive Services doc set. This quick start is all about interacting with Cognitive Services translator service through HTTP requests or RESTful calls, whatever you want to call those. Two prereqs are needed for this quick start. First, an Azure subscription. Second, you would need to have the .NET SDK installed on your machine. I point that one out. It's not listed here in the quick start. I will take that on and fix that. But you would need the .NET SDK to walk through the C# example in this quick start. Now what you're going to see right up towards the top is a platform setup section. And really what that's doing is it's going to have you create a .NET console application using the .NET CLI. So it's a .NET new command. And then we get into the meat of the quick start, which is all about doing things like text translation, text transliteration. The bulk of this will cover text translation. And so in the very first code sample that you'll see here, it'll be a piece of C# code that will translate from English to both German and Italian. And it's going to translate something very simple, just the phrase, hello world. Now to do this...
hey, Scott, just to interrupt you real quick, is your screen scrolling or are we still on the very top of the dock?
It's still at the top of the dock. I can certainly scroll. I'm still waking up here. So thank you.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't just me.
Yep. Thank you for calling that out. So if we catch up the doc to where I'm speaking here, it's this translate text section. This is where that C# snippet is that I'm referring to. And if you look at the things that are being done in this particular snippet, really what's going on here is we are sending an HTTP post request out to a translate endpoint. And to that translate endpoint, we are tacking on a query string, which contains an API version number, and more importantly, the source language code, which in this case is EN for English. There are two destination language codes we also pass in the query string. Those represent the languages that we are translating to. So in other words, translating from English to both German and Italian. Again, the source text is hello world, and that is passed in the request body. And then you'll also see some request headers being set here. The subscription key, for example. The payload that comes back is in JSON format, and that contains the translated hello world text for those two languages that I had mentioned. Now, you might look at this as a hardcore .NET developer and say, well, there are some things that could be improved here. Some things that I would call out would be, look at storing that subscription key in a secure fashion. So instead of hard coding it like it is here, maybe use something like an environment variable or Azure Key Vault, anything to improve upon the situation that's here, particularly when doing this in a production environment. You might also look at swapping out newtonsoft.json with system.text.json. Maybe you're just not interested in taking on another third-party dependency. That could be a way you could achieve that. You might also look at using the HTTP client factory here. So keep in mind, the code that's provided here is really intended just to get you started. You can certainly improve upon what's there. Towards the end of this doc, you're going to see a section that is all about detecting the source language. So the translator service can attempt to detect the source text language. So you could say, I have no idea what hello world is in terms of the language. We all know it's English. If that is the situation and you do not know the source language, you can simply omit the from parameter from the query string, in which case the translator service will attempt to detect the language name. What it's going to do in that case is actually return what it thinks is the language name, along with a confidence score. And the higher that confidence score, the better. In other words, the closer that number is to 1, the more confident we are that it accurately determined the source language.
So what you're telling me here is, for Star Trek fans, this is the universal translator.
Precisely. You could look at it just like that. I guess in summary here, I guess to wrap up this doc, there are other things here, but I'll let you dig into those yourself. There's also a detect endpoint. So up to this point, we've been using a translate endpoint. We've been sending requests to that. Let's say you only want to know what that source language is. You don't want to actually do the translation. In that case, you would rely on sending a request to the detect endpoint instead of the translate endpoint. So that, as I mentioned, that was the quick start for today, the checkup segment. If any of this interested you, you will see the vanity URL scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Definitely
Finally.
check that out. Yes, thank you, Cam.
It's been a few weeks.
So Mr. David Pine actually used to work on the cognitive services content team. So I'm curious, David, any closing thoughts here on this doc? Anything I messed up?
No, very well said, and pretty, very much accurate. There are different SDKs besides just the .NET. So one of the things we like to kind of highlight is that, Azure as a cloud offering is not just for .NET developers. It's for any, it's polyglot. You bring Python, bring JavaScript, bring Java, bring Go, all those things.
Yeah. Clearly, this is just a REST endpoint that really you can post to from anything. So
Yep. Yeah, we do focus extensively on C#, obviously on this show, but as I'm pointing out here on the checkup doc, let's say you, in addition to C#, you do Node development or you do Python development. There are code samples provided for that as well in the same quick start. So just click the tab for your language of choice and you're good to go.
Awesome. Cool.
With that, why don't we roll into the hallway track and see what David wants to cover today?
Let's do it. So, Dave,
Yeah.
You have some experience with that. That
Yeah.
whole cognitive services translation thing, right?
Yeah. So I first and foremost want to apologize to our viewers who are expecting to hear about MongoDB today. Again, our guest was not able to make it. So I offered up to share some of the stuff that I've been working on recently. So I've been focusing a bit on GitHub Actions. It's been a bit of a side passion and project of mine. So with GitHub Actions, you can really do a bunch of very powerful things. So if you're using GitHub as your source code, management control system, you can use what are called GitHub Actions to perform essential CI and CD pipeline things. But you can also do more than that. You can actually, basically, it's open to your imagination. So what I did was I said, as a .NET developer, it's somewhat tedious. Not even somewhat. It's very tedious. I guess that's putting it quite frankly. But if you want to embrace localization, and your native language is English, as an example, trying to provide different languages is hard. So typically, most development shops will, this is based on my experience, most development shops will rely initially on machine translation, and then from there determine some of the most popular languages that are being consumed by those applications. And they'll use humans to then review the machine translations and tweak them and massage them and update them. So I said, well, where do those machine translations come from? Is there a way for us to kind of automate that? So with GitHub Actions, go ahead.
So let me see if I'm capturing this right. Mm-hmm. So I used to work for an online banking vendor, right? They did online banking systems for banks. It was actually the company where Scott Hanselman used to work years and years and years ago. And they had a tool that they called the Localization Pseudowizer, which I think was actually something Scott put together. It was actually misspelled. It was, instead of pseudowizer, it was spelled Swaderizer. Anyway, what this thing would do is it would look at the resource file, like the English resource file, and it would take every character in the English resource file and replace it with a Unicode character that had different accents and umlauts and stuff, so that when you were looking at, if you just loaded the site in the Spanish locale, say Mexican Spanish locale, it would come up, and if it didn't have that Mexican Spanish resource file, what it would do is it would display that English resource file that had been, all the characters had been replaced with Unicode characters, so we could still read it, but it was very obviously not like Latin characters, right? I mean, not like the typical character set that we would use for English US.
Right. Yeah. So this is a very similar concept to that. It relies on resource files, and I'm going to actually share my screen now. It's shared.
So what David was talking about with the machine translation versus human translation, that is a very real scenario here on the Docs platform that Microsoft maintains. So for cost reasons, the bulk of our content is actually machine translated from US English to several other languages. I forget how many, but I want to say the top 10% of the content, they look at the highest traffic content we have, that is actually translated by hand by a team of humans.
Just real quick, does anybody happen to have an app handy that uses resource files? Because it occurs to me we probably have a lot of viewers who have never used resource files before.
I do. I have that. I have some apps I can show that demonstrate that. I want to touch on this real quick though. So our Docs platform, so docs.microsoft.com, you'll see in the URL, the route itself, there's en-us. You can actually click here to change your desired locale, and here are all the different languages that our docs support. So that's a pretty fair amount. So let me pull up an app that has that real quick. Since you specifically asked for resource files, I'm going to pull up plenty of resource files here. So that's a lot of resource files, and I'll touch on that. But we have a counter component. This is actually a Blazor WebAssembly application. And if you've seen the templates when you do file, project, new project, and you choose the Blazor WebAssembly, you'll get a counter component. So what I did was I actually added a counter.en.resx file. And this is a resource file that shadows that component. And I have all the little bits that were there. So like the click me. So there were some verbatim strings in our Razor component markup. And those verbatim strings were basically in English, right? That's how the template was. So what I have is a counter.en.resx file with those values in it. And in the component itself, we have, let me pull that up real quick. I'm going to scroll down because there's lots of them. And that's part of the complaint I have with how this is structured. So while I find that, where's Razor? Here it is. Ta-da. All right. So if I look at the actual markup itself, you can see that in order for me to use those resource files, I need to inject an iString localizer of that counter type. And then I'll have that localizer object. And there's a few bits of also middleware that are required. I'll show that real quick and then jump back here. So inside the, there's no startup. Where is it? Blah.
So for clarity, David, this iString localizer interface actually ships with .NET, correct?
Yes.
It's not something you created.
Very much so. That is correct. So what I have here is this is the client side application. So inside the client, you can see that I walk up to services and I say add localization. And this adds all of the required localization middleware services required for me to use localization within my Blazor app. Right. So now I can rely on a shadowed RESX file for my Razor component, a Blazor component in this instance. And I can inject an iString localizer of my counter type. And then for the title, I can say counter title. That's just an index that I'm using to walk up to that resource file. So as the culture info for this Blazor application changes, the app will need to be reloaded, and it will then rely on all of the other RESX files that correspond to the culture in context. So to put that a little bit more clearly is, as the culture info changes, the .NET culture info, the WebAssembly application will reload itself, and it will then rely on the corresponding locales. So then you can have translations, of all the different types that you want to support. So, I mean, that's been in .NET for a long time, and we're just showing it here with WebAssembly, which is awesome. But you can do this with UWP, WPF, WinForms, any background services, anything that you actually want to provide that type of dynamic switching of languages and locales. That's been in .NET for a long time. So that's nothing new. And actually having RESX files that shadow components or code behind, that's nothing new either. So, but as a developer, if I wanted to start from, file new project, and I wanted to have some sort of way to get all of these machine translations in place initially, that's where you can rely on GitHub Actions. So what I did was I wrote my first ever GitHub action.
Now, what language are GitHub Actions written in?
GitHub Actions are currently they run on Node.js, so you can use JavaScript or TypeScript. TypeScript obviously will compile down to JavaScript, or you can use a Docker container. So then any language that is capable of running from that and then being invoked from GitHub.
I didn't know that.
Yep. And I actually have the source code here for the machine translator itself, so we can look at some TypeScript if our friends or viewers are interested in seeing some of the TypeScript bits. So I'll show you the YAML right now, and so basically what you do is with this Blazing Translations WebAssembly application, we have a YAML file, and this is really what defines our GitHub action workflow. So workflows are taking various GitHub actions and composing them together. You can have a single GitHub action if you want, but mine is basically named create translation pull request, and it works on a push to the main branch. And we have this paths listing. So as you can see here, we're going to take action when we see any file changing that is .en.resx. So that's the only time that this will fire.
So in my app, I've got like resource files that have all the different strings for my labels and validations and whatnot. And I just have an English resource file. That's all we're doing here.
Yep. So you start with an English resource file. That's your starting point.
Okay.
And so basically we define a job. So the job's going to build on Ubuntu latest, and the steps are the sequential steps. And these steps can be interdependent, and they can, basically they can provide all of the various actions that you actually want to take. So the first thing that we'll do is we're going to use from actions, we're going to check out, and this is V2 of that. Actions exist in a marketplace on GitHub, and GitHub actually provides several very basic ones that you can use as building blocks. So go ahead.
So basically we can take dependencies of all those and like piece them together, like you said, like building blocks, and build like bigger actions out of smaller actions.
Yep. You can, I like to call it composing. So you can compose different things. And one of the things that's very, very common, they should probably make this part of like the standard bits, is you have to check out. So once you have your VM running, Ubuntu latest here, you can check out the repository, right? That triggered the change. And then from there, then you do whatever you need to do. So I'm going to check it out, and I have my resource translator, and this is the bit that I wrote. So the resource translator is named resource translator, and it has an ID. You can provide IDs to these things so you can refer to them later on. And it says it uses /resource translator and then my specific version. I've been working on this for a little while, so I'm already on V2 0.4.
David, question for you. If we can take a step back to where you define the runs on value, Ubuntu latest. I assume this is the hosted build agent, correct?
Yes.
So the reason why I ask is, maybe there's a use case where you need to build on Windows instead of Linux. Is there a hosted agent that would satisfy that need?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is literally the machine that your job will run on. And there are several that are out there, and you can pick and choose. I don't know where I think it's pretty well documented. So the listing of all the different things, and actually there's statement completion that exists within the marketplace when you're editing or creating YAML workflow files from within github.com. So once you start doing that, it's very intuitive actually as kind of a place to learn how to actually start using GitHub Actions and what some of the different capabilities are.
My follow-up question, unrelated to the previous, is I notice up top on line 7 in the YAML, you're specifying a resx file.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm not doing resource files at all, and instead of that, I'm using portable object localization, so using PO files.
Sure.
Does what you created here support that in any way?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. When I was initially developing this, I was kind of narrow-sighted in that I wanted to focus on resource files because that's what I knew as a .NET developer. But my buddy Tim Hewer suggested that I expand my horizons. He's been really remarkable at suggesting different things. So let me pull it up real quick. The resource translator actually right now has full support for RES text, RESX, and XLIF. RESX and XLIF are both XML-based file formats for translations. RES text is similar to INI, that's key value pair, and then PO, portable object, which you're referring to. So it has support for all 5 of these different types. So I had to actually write parsers and interpreters for those different types inside my GitHub Actions so that I could understand those. So some of the different possibilities for paths would be INI, PO, RES text, RESX, XLIF, right? And it's to be clear with XLIF, it's version 2. They don't have support in there for version 1. And it's not smart enough. They're pretty basic. I'm just not really familiar with them. And it's been hard for me to kind of write these parsers because there's a lot of different things that you have to understand about these different file formats. So the file parsers themselves will, when the GitHub action spins up, it'll look and determine which, well, first of all, the action will only be triggered once you as the developer decide that's what you want it to be triggered on. So if you say PO files, for example, to your point, Scott, it will only then look at PO files that had changed within the context of that trigger, right? Because it has a context object from GitHub inside the action itself that we can leverage to see what actually changed. And then from there, we can infer, okay, there's a PO file that changed. Let's look at the changes. It's either new or it has updates to it. And from those two things, we can then walk out to making that HTTP call to translator to update those files. And then it'll create a pull request.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. For folks who aren't familiar with Portable Object Loc, I did provide a link in the chat, so check that out. One particular advantage over the ResX files is that you, with the PO files, would have support for pluralization of your strings.
Yeah, so that's a really good call out because I'm not sure I know how to handle that in my translation efforts. And it's really hard. So I would happily welcome any viewers or anyone in the community who's interested in diving into this and potentially using this. There are a few caveats. One of the caveats is it's written in TypeScript. The other thing is to actually consume it, you have to have an Azure subscription so that you can rely on the translator API. And then there's not really clear ways to kind of debug it. I've been writing lots of unit tests. So those unit tests exists, and I have some source kind of test PO files. But plural is one of those things that's difficult to do. I believe I have it, with my unit test, I have it all there in place. So, go ahead.
Random thought here. I do know there are popular projects in the .NET ecosystem. Humanizer is one of those that handles pluralizing strings. I wonder if you could tap into that somehow to handle the pluralization requirement.
Yeah, that's a good ask. I'm not really sure. I don't know. I imagine if it's possible, we could do it.
Yeah, for example, you could take the word man and with Humanizer call a pluralize method on that, and it would return men as the plural form of that.
So I'd have to have some sort of logical tree inside my GitHub action implementation in TypeScript that would look at if you're using PO files and there are plural alternatives to take those source things and determine how to make those plural before even calling translator.
Yep.
There's so many moving parts.
I'm honestly just surprised that there's no existing project that already does some of these things. I'm kind of wondering too, with all the work that you've already put in, could those be components that you could pull out and have in separate repos and have people contribute to them? So like, what if I just wanted an RAX thing, or I wanted an INI thing, or I wanted a PO file thing separately?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I want them all together. I don't know. Like, people want different things. But
Absolutely.
Maybe that's something that you could pull out of your project, and then now folks can contribute to that as an individual effort.
Absolutely.
Does GitHub Actions support doing so we talked about how we can use actions as building blocks. Does it support doing any type of logic in an action where we say, if this condition, then follow up with this action, and if this other condition, follow up with this other different action?
Yep, it's all supported. They have all sorts of, they have a pretty basic set of different expressions and conditions that you can apply. So what I actually have here is getting back to the composition of this. So we check it out, and then we run our resource translator, and I give it an ID on purpose so that I can refer to it down here in this the third step. So step 2 is basically rely on my resource translator, and I need to provide some inputs. So when you say with, there's some named inputs that are, some are required, some are optional. A subscription key, we store that inside secrets. So we have this dollar mustache, or open curly brace, or whatever you want to call that. And then you walk up to secrets, which exists in the context of a GitHub action. And that is your repository secrets. So it basically encrypts any sensitive values, and any of those secrets that are used within your action inside your logs are actually output with an asterisk. It's smart enough to know not to display any of those things in logs. So that we have an Azure translator subscription key, we have an endpoint, we have a region, and we have our source locale. So we're saying that we're starting from English. And then Peter Evans actually created a GitHub action called create pull request. So what it does is it looks at a checked out version of your repository, and it says if there's any files that changed at this point in time, what it can do is create a pull request for those. And then you can say, here's the title, here's the body. And to your point, or your question, Cam, we have a condition here. So if steps.resource-translator.outputs has new translations equals true. And this is some barbaric looking if logic, but it's still possible. You can do that. So there's a conditional step. So if my resource translator, which has this output, which is a bit that is specifying whether or not there's been new translations. So I can determine that, right? I can look at the deltas, and basically I have this bit as part of my summary where when I'm done doing all my work, I say whether or not there was actually changes. And if there's been changes, this will create a pull request for it. And then from there, we have a summary title and summary details. And again, this is all inside your YAML file, only 33 lines of code, but it's relying on all these different components and tying all these things together. And the grand result is that you end up with, I'm going to show you, here's the Blazing translations repository. And again, it's a simple Blazor application. I show you in here how you can change the culture. Selecting different cultures will then rely on those different translation files. As you'll see here, and I can run it too if you want to see the demo live.
Well, I was just about to ask that. Do you have a app that we could beat up? And
yeah, let's just run it real quick. I'll show you that. First of all, this is just a kind of to show you that .NET will do what it's supposed to do. In that, when WebAssembly is running and you choose a different culture, it is going to then call into the correct language and change how the application's rendered, right? So wait for it. Of course, things will run slower when we're streaming.
So while it's running, if you're just joining us, we are here with our substitute guest this week. Our planned guest was unable to make it, so we pulled from the bullpen, as we said, and pulled in David Pine, and he is talking about localization with this really cool GitHub action he put together that does automatic machine translation.
Now, before we move on to what David was going to show here, we did have a question earlier. I will flash it up on the screen. I'm not sure if this was the intent of this particular question, but it gets to running a program, which I assume is a GitHub action, and that taking too much time. Mm-hmm. I'm going to actually rephrase this question into, is there a way to, test a GitHub action locally to tighten up that loop, that development loop, so that instead of testing everything from GitHub, there is maybe a way to test this all locally?
Yeah, that's one of the things that Tim Hewer and I were talking. We had a conversation actually with Martin Woodward recently, who's at GitHub and leading kind of the GitHub Action Initiative. And some of the things that we were discussing were exactly that. Like, are there different ways? What are the ways to develop a GitHub action and debug it locally? So I know that there's been some efforts with that. I don't think it's quite there yet. I think there's some open source things that exist. And I know that there's certain ways to kind of, there's certain kind of workarounds. And I've been doing a lot of, like I said, unit testing and stuff within my TypeScript application, which is actually pretty neat from Visual Studio Code. It's pretty nice. You can actually step through it, and it's a really good experience. But unfortunately, they don't have anything that's official officially public yet that I'm aware of.
So, Dave, I can't help but notice these are Deftone lyrics.
Yeah, they are. I'm actually quite impressed you've realized that. Yes, they are. Good job. That is, yeah, great. You called me out. Of course, my hat didn't give it away. So this is the translations, file, new project, and I added a few little bits here just to kind of show it. Like I mentioned before, we've got our title, and this is the English version, and you've got your current value. Hit click me, great, that works. And then the home page, it's got the summary, the survey stuff, and then I added just a paragraph here to show that. And then I got this button that'll actually open a modal that'll let you select a different culture. So we can choose from all of these different cultures within this application. So someone tell me something. What should I pick?
Someone in the crowd, pick out your native language that isn't English.
Yeah. I saw some people joining from Brazil before. I remember that specifically. Let's see if I can.
It would be under PTBR, I think.
This one? PTBR?
Yep.
All right, let's try it. Click. So then we hit select, and then the application actually has to fully reload because, again, it's client side, WASM, WebAssembly. So it's the entire .NET application is running in the context of the browser. So for the culture info to reload, here we go. So I don't, and this is, again, one thing I like to really make very, very explicit is that when you're dealing with artificial intelligence, whether it's machine learning, any of those different things, whatever it is, we need to put on our ethics hat. And we need to specify very, very clearly that these are machine translations and they should be treated as such. So there could be, cultural inaccuracies or things could be incorrectly.
You might inadvertently tell your audience that their hovercraft is full of eels. Is anybody getting the Monty Python reference, or am I just too old?
No.
I got it.
French.
I've actually never seen Monty Python, so I apologize.
Someone had asked for French, so I'm going to try that. We have several different variations of locale for French. So I just did France. So is this... again, this is machine translations from the source English. So your mileage may vary. If you're a French developer and your source is French and you're translating into different languages, I'd be really curious to see how the cognitive services translator service actually works in your case. I'd love to see that.
David, you bring up a good point there. The ethics topic. So Cam and I do a lot of Microsoft Learn modules. We create a lot of those. We ran into a specific example where some content was being machine translated, and the word that it was messing up was the word build. Seems innocent, right? That was actually being translated to something entirely different in another language. And the piece that was missing there was the context in which that word was being used.
And as I remember that particular instance, we had titled the module something like "Build a Web API," and in other languages it was getting translated. They were looking at the word "build" and applying in context. They were applying the translation that means compile, like compile your code, which really wasn't what we wanted.
So I think we talked before about pluralization being a challenge here. I think also knowing the context in which the term is used is another challenge. And how do you overcome that?
Right. Yeah, there's lots of things to think about. So that's why I always like mentioning at least the ethics standpoint, like be honest with your consumers of the applications, understand the limitations of what it is that you're actually trying to do, and embrace it. So a lot of times, go ahead.
Just as a example, the docs, the Microsoft Docs website, docs.microsoft.com, very clearly puts if you're using a document that has been machine translated, but not human verified, it very clearly puts a warning up at the top that says, hey, this is a machine translated document. Your mileage may vary, or whatever similar. There
was two other ones in here, Indonesian and Hindi. So I'm going to do that for the viewers who had specifically asked for it. And then we're going to jump into a little bit more of the action itself, because this is, I guess, the less exciting part. So I don't know how accurate this is. Again, this is Indonesian here. So this should say, something like "click me," showing off the binding.
And just to be clear to our Indonesian friends, we cannot validate this translation at all. So I mean, if it says just weird, non sequiturs, that's on Azure at this point.
Someone asked for Norwegian. What's the
culture code? Yeah, what's a culture code for Norwegian? I'm gonna guess it's NO. In something in W, I don't know. Wait.
Persian NO. Is it?
Yeah,
ND?
that looks like. Yeah,
this
that
one?
would be it right there. Yeah.
That either means no stop or the code is NO.
So yeah, I won't go there. I was gonna say no means no, but I just went there.
Here we go. So again, now we're just kind of validating the translatability of my random strings, Deftones lyrics, and some titles and placeholders. Again, this is just a demo app. It's out there on GitHub. Feel free to check it out. I
got a good question. Good question from the audience here.
Mm-hmm.
So when we send this up to Azure Cognitive Services, and when we're sending the string to be translated, is it just the language that it's asking for, or is it asking for culture and language? So so do we just say French, or do we say French, or Canadian French?
That's a great question. And so French is one example. Spanish is yet another example where there are different dialects of the Spanish language. I love this question.
So again, there are some limitations. The limitations with the translator API itself, and then now we're kind of, I guess, context switching a bit into the translator service and its capabilities. And I guess one of the nice things about being a GitHub Action is that you could plug in a different translator API endpoint. I think Cecil mentioned before, kind of taking these different components and pulling them apart. That could be one of the things where you create your own GitHub Action that has a different API endpoint that you want to hit, and you can totally do that. And this is source code for my version of it is out there, and anyone can look at it. But from the API, cognitive.microsofttranslator.com, you can walk up to languages and say, here's your API version, and we're going to scope it to translation. And this returns all of the translation locales that exist out there with their specific dialect explicitness. It actually has the direction, whether or not it's left to right for a language or right to left. But for example, if you want Arabic, let's see here. I think that, so you start with, they just use the 2 letters. So for English, it's EN. For like Arabic, for example, it's just AR. So they don't have, I don't think, specific different dialect. So what's this comment here?
So yeah, Black Fang was saying that his mom is a Norwegian English translator. He can say that the machine translation is completely wrong. Since we have a native Norwegian speaker here, I'm gonna very carefully dance around the specifics here. But if you're not aware, my last name is a very impolite slur in Norwegian. And I'm just not going to repeat it. I'm not going to give any definitions. Y'all can just rely on Google to figure that one out. But since we have Norwegian speakers here in the audience, I just felt I would acknowledge I'm aware my last name is a slur.
Hey Siri, what's the Norwegian translation of Soper?
Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that.
So I just wanted to show this real quick here. So with the Blazing Translations application, the WebAssembly app, what happens when you commit or you push rather to the main branch, you'll get a pull request, and this is what it looks like. So when you make a change that has an en.resx file changed, because that's how we specified our action to run, our workflow, you'll get a pull request as long as there's either updates or new files. So in this particular case, the title says, machine translated 308 files, a total of 770 translations. And some of the things that are interesting about that is that's a lot of translations. I made sure to change a lot of files to see how it would handle it, because I was actually trying to test there's rate limits on the translator API. So I actually have to have my GitHub action smart enough to handle batching and calculating on the fly of the byte payload size I'm sending the translator, and then, buffer it. And I manage all that for you. So we get all these translations. Here's the summary of it. We tell you what it's triggered by. So this is the specific change that triggered this, right? And I'll show you what that looks like real quick. All I did was change a few resx files, right? So I said, instead of click on this button to increment the current count, I just made a few variations there. So there's those files. There's some new files. Added a few, Deftones lyrics, of course. And then that's 4 files that changed, right? So there's one file changed, index en resx files changed, the culture selector file is changed, and then I actually updated the message ens, right? So 4 files changed, and as a result of those 4 files changing, we created 231 new files, right? Because those are translation files specific, and then the total translation counts for those. And then we updated 77 existing files that were already there. And it just gives you a summary of all these different things, right? It tells you the source locale, the destination locales that it translated to. And again, what you can do, one of the workflows you might want to have in your company or your development workflow to your software team, wherever you're potentially considering using this, is you could take this pull request and you can have those specific humans who are capable of doing, for example, Norwegian and English translations. They can go in here and use these as starting points, because these are just really placeholders. And you can use those starting points and clean them up and make sure they're accurate, and then, merge in the pull request once you've had all that. And then you can actually specify, maybe you don't want to have all 80 some whatever languages here. I think we show how many languages. No. I don't show that. I thought I had a tally of the total destination locales. It'd just be a simple count on these. But you can actually specify, we only want to have 3 or 4 different things that we're translating to. And you can really simplify it that way as well. And instead of having, just blasted with all these different things.
So I just had a wild idea. I know since we have David sharing this, David had created a profanity filter, which wasn't that a GitHub action as well?
It was not. This was before GitHub Actions existed.
So where I'm going with this, I wonder if we could marry that solution with this and create a safe for work setting, so that if we do attempt to translate Cam's last name and it ends up being some vulgar word, that is actually censored and comes back as a series of emojis or something like that.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, you could totally do that.
So this is a good question from a member of our audience, another Norwegian, actually. Hi, my last name's Soper. So he asks, can we apply this to I guess other platforms? I don't know what other platforms use for localization. What does Angular use, for example?
That's a good question. As of right now, it's pretty limited with its understanding of files. It does INI, RES text, some of the things that we already talked about. I am going to show you, though, the source code for it, because it's open source and you can jump in here and start doing whatever you want to do with it. So I'm going to close this out. We have several abstractions, our action, our API, our factories. So if we start up here at the top, this is basically just we have a TS config because we're using TypeScript. We have a package JSON because Node and npm, and then we have our action YAML. Our action YAML is required. This is the stuff that you actually see in the marketplace. So GitHub Marketplace for actions. You have a name, a description. You have your branding. So we've got a blue flag. We have our inputs. We show whether or not they're required. We have our outputs. All these different little things. We show where it runs and where to start. So our main entry point is index JS. So for me, that's our index TypeScript because we're using TypeScript. We're compiling to JavaScript. And so we have these different things that we rely on. These are packages coming from npm, so the Node package manager. And since it's TypeScript, when it installs this little NuGet package over on the Ubuntu latest, it's place where it's, the hosted service where it's running that, it'll actually basically do an npm install and then npm run against that entry point. So you can pull in, Cecil talked about this before. What if we wanted to, have more components? You can absolutely do that. You can pull in any components you want, anything that will run in the context of Node. So the @actions, this is actually coming from GitHub. So they have a bunch of core things. And I have a bunch of stuff. So I'm going to start. So I've got a constant run, which is an asynchronous, it's returning a promise where I'm going to try catch. Otherwise, we're going to fail. Is there a way to use Visual Studio easily? No. I mean, yeah. Anything that, so it's TypeScript. So if you have Visual Studio set up to where you can build TypeScript applications, yes, you can do that. When I write TypeScript, I prefer hands down Visual Studio Code. When I write .NET, C#, I prefer Visual Studio. So it's basically your preference. Visual Studio Code is entirely free. You can get a community version of Visual Studio. So it's basically at your discretion.
Sure.
So we start off.
Question for you too.
Yeah.
Like, so this is purely unrelated to anything that you're talking about. But I'm looking at like the way that you declare functions in TypeScript. And I'm kind of curious, is there a particular reason why you're using variables versus like just a plain function definition?
Yeah, I
noticed that in your other files too. Like they all have the same pattern. So I was kind of curious what the reason behind that was.
So for me, I'm kind of a language snob. So when it comes to C# and TypeScript, I like using some of the latest standards out there and some of the preferences for being a bit more declarative. But with TypeScript and, obviously JavaScript, functions are first-class citizens. They can be treated as such. So we can just, declare a constant run, which is basically equal to this asynchronous little wrapper. So for me, it's just the way I read the code. I think it becomes more intuitive once you get used to it. I don't know. And it's a less verbose way of writing it, because function is how many letters in the word function versus saying here's a fat arrow, and all the context and stuff works. So it's just a preference, a personal preference.
Okay.
So I'm importing this start function, and we're gonna navigate into that. And basically, it's an exported async function. So I could have done that, to your point. This could have been one of those const that's exported. So instead of saying that, we could have said, we could have written it as an exported constant function rather than being a function itself that's being exported. It's the same thing. So we have our inputs, and if the inputs are not truthy, we're going to set failed. Otherwise, we're going to get the available translations, and that hits that API endpoint that pulls back all of those different capabilities from the translator. So then this is where all the gyrations come in, where we're mapping out the available translation types. We're seeing what we want to translate to. We're going to find all of the translation files. So this basically is on the local file system from Node.js using the FS, file stream and path imports from Node.js. So then we can actually interact and pull things from the file system, which is our checked out context from our repository. So we can see all the things that had changed. And, we have a results object there. So we got if it's PO file, or if it's RES text or RESX or INI or XLIF or whatever it is. Then we're going to start iterating through all of those things. And we have a translation file parser factory. And this factory is actually where we inject our different types. So depending on the file extension, that's where we return our individual parsers for the different file types. So this is where you could get, into building out different components of, say for Angular has a different file format. What does that parser look like? Well, as long as that parser implements a translation file parser, which is a pretty straightforward interface. The interface says we're going to parse from the string. So I will, in my GitHub action, read out the raw string input from that file. If it's a PO file, if it's an RES text file, whatever the file is, and you have to promise to return me a translation file, right? And that translation file is what's going to flow through the rest of this implementation. So you're going to give me a translation file from a string. You're also going to give me a formatted string, so whatever the file format is, so I can write it back to disk from a translation file. You're going to also have to apply those translations. So here's the instance, here's the translations, which is basically just a key value pair lookup and the target locale, and then a translatable text map, which is from your file type, what are the different things that can be translated. So if you can fulfill those 4 different things within this contract, you know, whatever Angular has for their implementation, it's pretty simple to kind of plug that in and make that work. So to answer the question, it's possible. It's just not yet implemented.
And from what I'm hearing, there's like a really clear roadmap to implement it, though, right?
That's the idea.
So yeah, I can't remember who asked the question. It was a ways back. It was this gentleman from Norway. That said, you know, can we do different formats like Angular? That sounds to me like a pull request opportunity. I'm just saying.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd love to you know, review that. So yeah, once you get your different parser from whatever kind we're iterating with, we're going to look at the different files. We're going to read the file. We're going to call the parser parse from. Here's the file content. We're going to say, given that parsed file in whatever format it is, give me a translatable text map. And I'm going to show you some of these other things real quick, because it gets, some of these abstractions are like a little, I guess, curious. So there's IO, you don't need to worry about that. Helpers, don't worry about those. File formats. So here are the different file formats. Here's the base type. So there's a translation file is a union of any of these types. So a portable object file, a resource file, an RES text file, an XLIC file. So you could have, you know, Angular translation file, right? Whatever it is, just make that, you know, part of this union type here, and then define it. So if we look at resource files have a root, and they have data, and they have named attributes, and this is, you know, basically different little helpers here on that. A PO file is a lot more elaborate. There's different message GUIDs, whether or not it's plural, and it gets a bit more verbose, but all of these are different types of translation files. So again, all you have to do is just take the time to kind of build this out, and you'll have kind of what you're looking for.
So Dave, we're coming up on the 3-minute mark here. Wanted to make sure David got a chance to, for one, share the URL to the GitHub repo again.
That's what I was going to say. Well, also the GitHub repo, and make sure that folks know where to find the action if they want to pull it into their action and use it and consume it.
Yep.
Pulling it up right now. Blue flag is called out before. So I shared in the chat here the actual source code for the machine translator, but then also the marketplace location of the machine translator GitHub action itself. And again, this is just one GitHub action. You can compose all these things. You can put them together however you want. You can make them as simple or as complex as you want. You can, if you want to plug in a different API endpoint, the world's yours. It's open source. Do it.
Yeah, this was really great. Like I've never used RxX files before, REX files before, to be super honest with you. Like I've worked on apps that have used them, but I've never really had to touch them. So I'm really interested to going into your repo and seeing how that works. I'm also kind of thinking too, it'll be really interesting if in a future show, maybe like you could show us how to maybe build a GitHub action using .NET and like using that Docker container thing that you spoke about earlier. I think that'd be really useful for a lot of people that might be watching or listening right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to do that too. I know that Tim Hewer actually had an example of him doing that, because I was asking the same thing, because I'm like, well, you know, I'm going to write a new application. I want to choose C#, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Awesome. Who do we have next week?
So it looks like our co-host, Luis Quintanilla, is going to be joining us, and he's going to be talking about functional programming with F#.
Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah, F#. I find that to be one of the things that I look at and go, "Ooh, that's scary and makes no sense to me." So I'm hoping that he can demystify it a little bit.
David,
Yeah.
can we get a F# to C# translator? Can we have that by the next show?
You can write it in Roslyn or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll use code generators. There you go.
See, there you go.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, this was the .NET Doc Show, and thank you again to David for sharing his creation with us.
Thank you for having me.
Next week, everybody.
Bye, friends.
See ya.